Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication History Division's Donald L. Shaw Senior Scholar Award. In 2019, Broussard received the LSU Rainmaker Award. Broussard's research interests include the Black press, representations of racial and ethnic minorities, media history, alternative media, crisis communication, public relations, strategies and tactics, and the civil rights movement. She is the author of the 2013 National Award-winning book, African American Foreign Correspondents, A History, which followed Giving a Voice to the Voiceless, 4 pioneering Black women journalists. Copies of African American Foreign Correspondents are available for purchase from the LSU Press tonight, and we will be giving one away. Of course, yes. As a public relations professional, she was the Director of Public Information for the City of New Orleans and simultaneously served as press secretary to Mayor Sidney Bartolome in New Orleans for nearly 8 years. It's my distinct pleasure, and please give a warm applause and welcome to Dr. Jinx Coleman Broussard.
Thank you, Steve. I am so pleased to be here tonight. I see several friends and colleagues in the audience, so thank you for coming. I welcome the opportunity to discuss the phenomenal men and women, Black men and Black women, who use their pens and their voices on behalf of the race during seminal periods in the nation's history. But before I begin to talk about the cast of characters who are in my 2 books, I'd like to share with you a little bit of information about the Black press. And did I say that the lives of those men and women are as exciting as the stories that they wrote? Did I say that their work covers the broad expanse of government and society, race and media, race and government, and race and society? And so as I begin to talk about the Black press, let me begin with the quote by that was in the prospectus of Freedom's Journal. And just allow me to turn my head a little bit to read that quote. It said, "Daily slandered, we think there ought to be some channel of communication between us and the public through which a single voice may be heard in defense of 500,000 free people of color." Those words were in the prospectus of Freedom's Journal, the first Black newspaper founded by African Americans. And Freedom's Journal avowed that no longer would Blacks allow white newspapers to routinely vilify and degrade Blacks. And as such, the Black press, next slide, became the eyes, the ears, the voices. They were advocates and forums of protest, pride. They corrected misrepresentation. They said Black is beautiful. Black people do wonderful things. They corrected misrepresentation, as I said, chronicled accomplishments. That was one of the main things that they did, chronicled progress as they informed, entertained, and educated. Next slide. And so what I would like to do now is talk about some of the pioneering Black women journalists I wrote about in my first book. Ida B. Wells was a journalist and an activist. I argue that she was also a muckraker in the tradition of Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens. She is known for starting the anti-lynching campaign in the United States and carrying it through. Why do I call her a muckraker? Because she did just what Ida Tarbell and what Lincoln Steffens and other muckrakers did. She knew, she firmly believed that the lie upon which lynching was based needed to be exposed. And she argued that the rationale for lynching Black men, she also was able to show through her detailed research. She researched white newspapers, she collected data, she traveled to the site of lynchings, and she wrote scathing editorials that took the nation to task for its lynching. She also pointed out that not only Black men were lynched, but also Black women and Black children. And she gave the example, she gave the dates and the times. And so Ida B. Wells, as I said, started that anti-lynching campaign. And during the time she wrote about lynching, 6 Southern states eventually outlawed lynching. So she was quite a figure. She made quite a few enemies. She wrote in 1898 that economic reprisal was the real reason for lynching. And she told the story about a friend of hers and his 2 business partners who were lynched primarily because they opened a store in the Black neighborhood not far from a white storekeeper's store. And a white mob went to ransack the store, and those 3 Blacks shot one of the guys. They were hauled off to jail, taken out of jail on a rail cart, and lynched. And so she told that story, and she embarked on her anti-lynching campaign. I can talk more about that during the question and answer period. I will skip to Mary Church Terrell, who wrote around the same time that Ida B. Wells did. Ida was militant. She was an agitator, and she called herself an agitator. Whereas Mary Church Terrell, I call her the gentle woman. She gently prodded the dominant society to give African Americans status, to give them equality. And she felt that her manner of doing that was much more important. Now, I have Amy Jacques Garvey in the middle. What I will say about her is that while Ida and Mary, they're my friends, I spent a lot of time with them, researching them. While Ida and Mary wanted to join American society, wanted acceptance from American society, wanted equal right and social justice, Amy Jacques Garvey, who was married to Black nationalist and separatist Marcus Garvey, said, forget about a country that does not recognize you as human beings, let alone as equals. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to now segue to African-American foreign correspondents. When I first started my research on African-American foreign correspondents, I had no idea that the genre existed. I found thousands of articles written by Blacks from overseas. I argue that African-American foreign correspondence began as a result of slavery and the status of Black people in the United States. And I say this because Frederick Douglass, who was a runaway slave, an abolitionist, he left the United States with a bounty on his head and headed for Great Britain. He wanted to bring pressure. He wanted to tell the story, first of all, of what he called that dastardly, peculiar institution of slavery. His major goal was not just to tell the story, but to have the British people bring pressure to bear on the United States to end slavery at home. And he wrote, I am seeking to hear, feel, and see all that may be seen, heard, and felt, and neither the attention I am receiving here, nor the connections I hold to my brethren in bonds shall prevent my disclosing the results of my observations. I believe the sooner the wrongs of the whole human family are made known, the sooner those wrongs will be reached. Frederick Douglass thus became the first African-American foreign correspondent. I call him an accidental foreign correspondent because he did not go overseas to report and send back information to the United States, which is what foreign correspondence is: letters, articles, and so forth, written abroad for dissemination at home. He went to tell the story of slavery and to dictate how other countries treated their non-white population. Next slide, please. A few years after Frederick Douglass returned from Great Britain, Mary Ann Shadd Cary also became an accidental foreign correspondent. She had been born a free person of color. Her father had means, and they could have passed for white because they were descendants of slave masters. Well, let me just correct that. Don't say that, Jinx. I'm getting a little bit carried away here. Her great-grandfather was a German mercenary who came to fight in the American Revolutionary War. He was injured, and Mary Ann Shadd Cary's grandmother nursed him back to health and married him. So she was not the descendant of slaves. Why did she become a foreign correspondent? She didn't set out to be one. She decided at the age of 28, she was very opinionated, that she was going to leave the United States after the Fugitive Slave Act of the Compromise of 1850 was passed. And that act allowed the armed pursuit and capture of runaway slaves. Well, Mary Ann Shadd Cary was a free woman of color, but she understood that what she called that odious law made no distinction between the free Black and the slave. And I know you all have heard of the movie 12 Years a Slave. Well, she did not want to be in that position. So she headed to Canada, which did not have slavery. And while there, she wrote a pamphlet called A Plea for Immigration. And she also published the Provincial Freedom newspaper that you can see on the screen. She gave Blacks reasons to move to Canada. She solicited information, she interviewed people, she collected data, she showed tables regarding the climate, because the mainstream media in the United States was telling Blacks that it was too cold in Canada for them. So she was very strategic in presenting every kind of information that would allow Blacks to become successful in Canada. And she encouraged Blacks to do so. During the years that she published the Provincial Freeman and that she lived in Canada, 15,000 Blacks immigrated to Canada. Next slide, please. And so now I'll segue to just some of the editors and publishers of the Black press who engaged in foreign correspondence, but who were writing even before they started to do foreign correspondence. Robert Abbott was the founder and publisher of the Chicago Defender. He started that newspaper because his stepfather said Black people needed a defender, and thus the name, the Chicago Defender. One of the main things I wanted to point out today is that the Chicago Defender started the first foreign news service in the 1920s. So here I am thinking about foreign correspondence as a primarily white enterprise. You know, the dashing, the daring, the suave men, and the sometimes courageous woman. However, Robert Van was the editor of the Pittsburgh Courier. The Pittsburgh Courier sent Joel Augustus Rogers, and I'm just giving you little snippets, sent Joel Augustus Rogers to Ethiopia to cover the Italian-Ethiopian War. And it even changed the name and called it the Ethiopian-Italian War to give primacy to that little African nation. And Van wanted the world to know that little African nation's story as it faced the war machine of Mussolini. The Pittsburgh Courier, another little factoid I'd like to point out, scooped all other publications when it sent a cable to Adolf Hitler prior to the Olympics in 1936, and he got a response. Okay, so these people had grit and determination. They found a way to make things happen. And Van went to Germany and covered the Olympics. And we know what happened in that Olympics, do we not? Jesse Owens broke the 200 mile, the 200 meter, the 100 meter. Another Black broke a world record with a high jump, and so forth and so on. And Carl Murphy, who was the son of the publisher of the Afro-American, also reported from Haiti and other places. The 1930s were the primary decade of African-American foreign correspondence. But so now I'm going to move to World War II, I think is the next slide. Well, this has to do with my book and the seminal periods that I talked about. Slavery, World War I, the interwar years of the 1930s, I call the defining decade. World War II, African liberation, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and post-integration of the newsrooms. Next slide, please. What was the rationale for Black foreign correspondents? I wanted to know, just as I wanted to know about these Black women journalists, I wanted to know, why did Blacks go overseas? They wanted to give visibility and voices to people of African descent. They wanted to see for themselves, to tell the true story, the real story, the other side of the story. Ladies and gentlemen, friends in the audience, I cannot tell you how many times I saw the words, other side of the story, our story, the real story, the true story. They also primarily, why? They wanted to affect social change in the United States, political change. They wanted to change the status of Blacks in this country. And they also wanted to change the perception of Black people and other people of color throughout the world. Ebony Magazine was founded because one of the reasons, he said, was that the world looked at Africa as a nation of savages. It looked at Black people and didn't understand that we got married, went to school, had children, held jobs. And so part of the mission was to change the perception of people of color in the United States and worldwide. The Black press spent a lot of time addressing colonialism, Western imperialism, and of course, racism. And so now I'll move to World War II. Initially, I thought that that was the golden decade, but I will point out to you that Black newspapers fielded 30 reporters in all theaters of the war during World War II. Why? They wanted to give visibility to the troops. They focused on their accomplishments, their valor, their gallantry, and their grit. They believed that if they could show the United States that these soldiers were loyal and that they were fierce, that they loved their country, that America would then give Blacks freedom. After all, America was fighting for freedom abroad. And so that's one of the things also that the Black press, foreign correspondents did. It exposed the hypocrisy of the United States as it espoused freedom overseas, but denied Blacks freedom at home. So I loved reading the stories, the eyewitness accounts, and the personal journalism of those Black foreign correspondents. They worked to humanize the troops. So there were all kinds of little human interest stories. They became a part of the story. I remember John Rover Jordan writing about how an airplane crashed, how a bomber crashed right at his feet, maybe 3 feet away. They put you on the scenes just the same way that mainstream foreign correspondents did. Next slide. And here is what the Pittsburgh Courier said. about going overseas. We will tell the story of how our boys are fighting for freedom. We will assemble stories on what America's Black fighters were doing for democracy at home and abroad. A major theme was we love our country, please love us back. And Edgar T. Rousseau wrote, close your eyes, flick a cigarette, and you will hear the soldier's throaty oath. Name your state, anywhere, anyone from Florida to California and from Maine to Texas, and a Black American will speak to you. So what they were telling the story here again of Blacks fighting in the war and that they came from all corners of the United States. Next slide, please. And so this is one of my favorite people, Arabelle Thompson. She grew up in North Dakota. She went to all white schools. Her only interaction was with whites. She graduated from one of the campuses of the University of North Dakota. After several jobs following graduation, she moved to Chicago and looked for work as a journalist, and she did not get work. One day, the editor of Ebony magazine, John H. Johnson, knocked on her door. He had read her autobiography titled American Daughter, where she talked about growing up in the Midwest. He liked her story, but he also loved her prose. And so he knocked on her door and she answered. Now, remember, I told her she had been looking unsuccessfully for work. So he introduced himself and he told her he wanted to offer her a job at Ebony magazine. And she said, well, Mr. Johnson, I don't know a thing about Negroes. And he said, that's all right, little lady, because she was 5 feet. I'll teach you. He hired her as a staff writer, and within 2 years, she was the associate editor of the newspaper, of the magazine. Her job between 1953, she began in 1953 to cover the African liberation movement. And she traveled to 18 different countries between that time and 1959. She said she wanted to go back to Africa to see if it was as dark as the mainstream media and society accepted it to be. She wrote primarily positive stories from Africa, even though we know that liberation was not going that well in so many instances, okay? And I can talk more about her. She remained with Ebony until she was almost 85 years old. Almost 85 years old. She was quite a figure. And so as I begin to conclude, I will talk about, next slide, William Worthy Jr. He is going to be the subject of my next book. He was more than a Black foreign correspondent. He was not necessarily interested in reporting from through the racial lens. His major focus while he wrote about race was free press. And so I fell in love with him because he transformed American foreign correspondence. That is a major occurrence in the history of the press. How did he do that? In 1951, the United States passed the McCarran Security Act, 1950, I believe, that proscribed travel to countries, communist countries, or countries that were deemed not in the national interest. Well, William Worthy was a firm believer in the First Amendment. He believed in freedom of the press. He also believed that in order to have an enlightened citizenry, we needed information to know. And so he defied that press ban, was eventually arrested and so forth. And I can tell you more about him in the question and answer. So as I conclude, what I'd like to say is that African-American foreign correspondence, one, it's a tremendous amount of it. Two, it was an important antidote to the mainstream media. Three, it juxtaposed Americans' treatment of Blacks in this country with how other nations treated their non-white others. And it looked at the shared identity between people of color all over the world. They had a transnational perspective. In the end, I argue that while some people might have said that the reporting by these Black foreign correspondents and one white woman, I will tell you about her in the question and answer also, um, that reporting was really a conversation about democracy in the United States. Sadly, what those reporters tried to do, what the Black press tried to do in terms of bringing about social change, did not happen. There were some successes following World War II. We had successes in the 1960s and so forth and so on. But if we look today, we still see the same kinds of images, which is what the Black press didn't like. They said that the mainstream media focused on the pathological side of Black life, which was crime, crime, crime. And that stories that showed Black people's accomplishments against all kinds of odds never saw the light of day. And so I conclude again with that correspondence was a conversation about race and government, race in media, race and society, but even more so, it was a conversation about democracy in the United States. Thank you for paying attention. And I hope I didn't gloss over too much. And so, do we have any questions? Yes. Yes. Mary Church Terrell. Okay, the gentleman is asking me to speak a little bit more about the Mary Church Terrell's approach to race, as opposed to Ida B. Wells's approach to race. Let me be clear that both of them had the same goal. Ida was strident. She made enemies. She made enemies in the Black press. She made enemies with Black people because she spoke truth to power. She didn't just criticize mainstream America. She criticized Blacks and urged Blacks to elevate themselves. Mary Church Terrell, as I said, took a different approach. She believed in more conversations, more discussions, joining interracial organizations, and she felt that that was the way. She wrote articles about the progress of Black women. She reported on their successes and so forth. So that was pretty much the difference. They were trying to do the same goals, but they just had different approaches. And they were not friends, even though they lived at the same time and did the same kind of work. Yes, Mary. Right. So Mary Ann is asking about the Black correspondents during World War II writing for the Black press, and the audience was Black. One of the things that I did not say was that the Black press knew that whites read their newspapers. Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, all of them knew that whites read their newspapers. In addition to that, the some of the reporters became pool reporters, which means that they were with white correspondents reporting in pools. So, for example, Ollie Stewart was with Dwight Eisenhower when he visited the war zone and so forth. So they wrote primarily for the Black press with the knowledge that whites read their newspapers, especially whites in power. So that was one. I'm glad you asked that question because I didn't bring that up. I also say, I firmly believe, and Red Tails had not come out when my book came out, Red Tails, the story about the Tuskegee Airmen. I thought I had a slide up there that had some of the newspapers in the background. But I believe firmly that were it not for those Black troops, those Black foreign correspondents chronicling how those Black Tuskegee Airmen, they weren't called that, how they shot down Jerry's, as they said, how they shot down Japanese bombers. Stories after stories after stories in the Black press chronicled what those Black fighter pilots were doing. Now, I said fighter pilots. However, those those pilots were supposed to be flying support mission. They were not having that. They engaged the enemy. They made the enemies pay. And as I said, stories documented just how much success those pilots, as well as other Black troops, were having on the war front. Did that answer your question? Yes. Ida B. Wells to a male personality. During her day, now, I might compare her to, he's not a reporter, but I might compare her to Al Sharpton. You know, a lot of people don't like Al. They hated Ida. Even Blacks disliked her. Yes. So his name comes to mind because, Al is all over the place. Ida B was all over the place. She once wrote, she traveled to the site of a lynching and she saw someone who was, I've forgotten the age of the young person who was attending that lynching, because Ida B. Wells also publicized that lynchings involved people who went to church on Sunday and went to the town square to watch the lynching. She put in great detail how lynching was carried out. Very, very gruesome. It's not just hanging somebody from a tree. It had to do with the most heinous kinds of activities. And so Ida had written about someone who was lynched for ostensibly raping a little 7-year-old girl. Well, years later, at the site of another lynching, Ida saw that young person who was supposed to have been raped and murdered. And so she told those stories and she provided the proof. She quoted the Times-Picayune. She quoted the New York Times. She provided charts, statistics, graphs that showed exactly where lynching was taking place. And so, yes, to answer your question, I know I went over and over with her, but those are some of the kinds of things that gained her enemies. I think I saw another question over here. Well, one of the things I didn't get a chance to talk about was what happened after integration of the nation's newsrooms, because the star Black reporters went to work for mainstream media. Mainstream media promised them a steady paycheck, which the Black press could not do, and it provided them more visibility. And so, the Black press now does not, well, after integration, the Black press declined. Lack of Blacks were reading other publications. Lack of advertising revenue was a chronic problem throughout the history of the Black press. Lack of subscribers, another chronic problem. And so, but what we do have now, we have more than 200 Black publications that are members of the National Newspaper Publishers Association. They are reporting, they have online sites, and they are still trying to carry out the mission of the Black press. One of the problems is readership, because where are we now? We're online. We're reading the New York Times. We're reading the Washington Post. We're not necessarily reading the Louisiana Weekly. We're not necessarily reading the Chicago Defender, the online versions or any of the versions. So the Black press, I'll give you an example. In New Orleans, the New Orleans Tribune celebrated its 25th anniversary about 2 years ago. And it is very much in the vein of the early Black press. So it holds people accountable. And I do believe that it has a substantial readership, but nothing like the 15,000 subscribers that the Crisis magazine had, or the numerous, the Chicago Defender became a daily newspaper in 1956. Fascinating story with that newspaper. Robert Abbott was a genius. He started that newspaper with 25 cents at his mother's kitchen table. And he recognized that the formula for getting readership was sensationalism. And so he had sensational headlines. He also recognized that his paper could not be distributed in the South. And so he got porters traveling on trains throughout the South to throw the Defender out of the train's windows to waiting people in various cities. And as I said, by 1956, it had become a daily. It was a national newspaper. I read that paper when I graduated from college and had my first job at Dillard University. And I learned about the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier because we got those newspapers on those Black college campuses. Yes. Publications in Louisiana by people of color. Well, interestingly enough, I know I'm going to get his name, so I'm not going to use it, but the New Orleans Tribune was a Black newspaper that operated or printed early on also, and addressed some of the same issues that the Ida B. Wells and them were addressing. Let me also say that the Louisiana Weekly in New Orleans is over 125 years old, and it is still trying to tell the Black story and to provide the Black perspective. Yes. I don't remember about the printing press. I'm sure he had to get it printed. These are some of the little facts that kind of escape you. But he was the writer, the editor, and the publisher, and the distributor. And so the paper grew exponentially as it defended the race. I didn't mention Afro-American newspaper. And in its heyday, it had 13 nations in various parts of the country. And so those 7 Black foreign correspondents who rotated throughout the war worked for and reported for those for those different editions. Let me also say that the Afro-American published a book after the war that told the story of the war. And so that's another thing that the Black press and Black journalists did. They found other kinds of ways to get their stories out. Sometimes they appeared on the Today Show, sometimes on CBS, sometimes in the New York Times. William Worthy wrote for the Boston Phoenix and other mainstream publications. And so, do I have another question? Because I want to tell you all a little bit more about William Worthy. Did I see another question here? Oh, sorry. Well, the work of the publishers were synonymous with the work of their newspapers. They often reported. They were also foreign correspondents. And so what they did was intertwine with what they had their reporters do. And so when I write about foreign correspondence in the Chicago Defender, I write about Robert Abbott. He had a philosophy. He went to South America in 1929 because he thought it was a more egalitarian society. He's traveled for about 3 months. He went to Portugal, not Portugal, what's the place? Yeah, Yes, so, so I knew I would get in trouble trying to remember these countries, Argentina and so forth. And his philosophy, as I said, was that those countries had a more egalitarian um, situation. However, he faced discrimination. He faced discrimination in Europe when he went in 1929, and he faced discrimination in South America. But that did not coincide with the story that he wanted to tell. He had been turned away from hotel after hotel after hotel in these different countries as he and his wife sought lodging, but he glossed over that. Or either he blamed America. He said that whites had, or Westerners was the word that he used, had tainted these countries. And so rather than blaming them for their lack of, or blaming them for their racism and their prejudice, he blamed it on the American government. And so here I want to point out that everything that these reporters or these correspondents wrote was not necessarily true. And I just gave you an example. But the goal was to present a different perspective in order to say to America, you can be better. Yes. Okay, William Worthy. How much time do I have? Okay, let me tell you about William Worthy. I've already told you how he transformed foreign correspondence, which was a major, major moment in the history of the press. His life, his career reads like a spy novel. When I start my chapter off on William Worthy by pointing out that on Christmas Eve in 1956, William Worthy was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. He arrived at his room and he found a visa and a plane ticket to China. He got dressed right away. He knew he was already on the radar of the State Department and the FBI because he had already reported from Russia. Remember, I told you that the US did not want reporting from communist countries, and he had reported from Korea. So he traveled to Logan Airport, hopped a plane to Tokyo, and by the next day or so, he was in China, and he reported from China. He found information about what was taking place in China, and he presented that information primarily in the Afro-American newspaper because he primarily worked for the Afro-American newspaper or freelance from them. It wasn't as if he was on the staff, he freelanced. And he went back to China again. When he returned from China in 1957, the United States wanted to confiscate his passport, but he had already sent his passport ahead. So they could not confiscate his passport. He proceeded to travel, and I made out a little timeline of where he went. He traveled to 33 countries between 1947 and the 1980s. And most of those countries, the United States did not want him to travel to. So in 1960, when Fidel Castro overturned the Batista government, William Worthy traveled there. And when he returned, he was arrested at the airport in Miami. He went to trial. Well, before he went to trial, he testified before a subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he made the case for First Amendment rights and the right to know, because he said in order for us to know, we have to have the information. His trial, I believe, was in 1962. He was found guilty, sentenced to 5 years in prison. It was reduced to 9 months probation. He was acquitted in 1964 on appeal. But in the meantime, he had traveled to other places. In fact, he sneaked into Cuba on a boat. and with the federal agent, thought he recognized William Worthy and asked him, "Are you William Worthy?" And he said, "No, I'm so and so," because he used aliases. He traveled to clandestine locations. Um, he traveled to war zone. He says that he was the first the first reporter, not Black, because Black was not necessarily in his frame of reference as much so as with other Black foreign correspondents. He said he became the first Black person to report from Russia in 1947. But reporting from, what did I just say? Cuba? What was the place I said? Um, Senior moment here. He reported from North Vietnam. He was the first American reporter to report from, hear me, North Vietnam, not South Vietnam. So clearly, he was not the favorite person of the US government or of the mainstream press, because he also said that the mainstream press was complicit with government and followed a government agenda, as opposed to seeking the other side of the story, as opposed to providing the other perspective. And I had a chance to go to Harvard in 2008. Harvard's Lehman Foundation was honoring William Worthy. And I got a call. I was like, "William Worthy here." And it said, someone who had been his mentee called me, and I had interviewed this person for the book. And he said, William will be receiving an award from Harvard. I tell you, the Manship School is phenomenal. Shout out to Jack Hamilton when he was dean, who also planted the seed for this foreign correspondence book. I went into the dean's office and I said, "I have an opportunity to go to Boston to interview William Worthy. Can I get permission to go?" And he said, "Yes, use your professorship money." And I did. I flew to Boston. I attended the ceremony. William Worthy was almost like a pitiful character. He said early on that his fighting the US government cost him a job at CBS, because he had freelanced for ABC, he had freelanced for CBS. And so I interviewed him and I asked him, he was in the early stages of Alzheimer's and he has since died. I asked him what drove him. And he said, to change the status quo and to make America a better person. I mean, I couldn't believe that he said that, because he was not in good shape. He died penniless in a nursing home. And so his free speech battle, his fighting the government, and his fighting mainstream media cost him dearly. But he believed in the public's right to know, and he believed in freedom of speech. Doesn't that sound like a book? So I don't know how much time I have left. Okay, 8 minutes. Yes, yes. Well, I will tell you that while I was at Dillard University, I was also a facilitator and an instructor for a New York Times Student Journalism Institute. And we did this for 10 years on the campus of that little HBCU. And Yamiche Alcindor was my mentee. Okay? All right. So I know Yamiche. She may not remember me. I was just a little old Dillard faculty member. And guess what? My kids say, "Mom, can you please stop telling everybody that you were her mentor?" This woman was already on the road to success. You were just driving her around. So those have been great experiences. Okay, so let me just tell you about one other person, Nancy Kennard. She was a white British socialite. and the heir to the Cunard shipping line. She became a correspondent for the Black press. She covered the Spanish Civil War. She also covered, wrote about World War II. She was not at the war front, but she wrote about World War II. Her association with Black causes and with Black men caused her family to disinherit her. She died penniless also on the streets of New York City, on the street in 1967. But she firmly believed in the Black cause, and she championed that cause. So I really wanted to mention her also. Yes, yes. What really surprised me is the question as I did the research on the Black foreign correspondence. And I'll tell you one thing that really stood out and was an eye opener for me. And it was at the very beginning of the project. Hamilton was working on his book on foreign correspondence. And he knew that I was going to Hampton University. I've forgotten, for a conference or something. And he said, Jinx, while you're there, can you look for information about this guy named John Rover Jordan? I think he was a Black foreign correspondent. So I don't know if you all can gauge this by me. I get very excited. So I went to the Hampton Library, 7:00 in the morning. For 3 days, I stayed from 7, and the custodian walked me back to the hotel at 11 at night, right before the hotel closed. Why? Because that is when I found out about those 30 Black men and one woman who was reporting on World War II. What an eye opener. I had no idea that had taken place. It's not anywhere. It's not in the public sphere. So that, I think, was a crystallizing moment for me. The other crystallizing moment was realizing that Frederick Douglass became that accidental foreign correspondent, and that Mary Ann Shadd Cary also became an accidental foreign correspondent. I was excited when I found that information, and it just whet my appetite and wanted me to look for more. So I started with that period, and then I went back and back and back, and one source led to another. I went to the Schomburg Research Center as part of the New York Public Library. Howard University, which is it? Yeah, part of the New York City Library. The Moreland Spingarn Research Library at Howard University. My writing on Marcus Garvey, I found a lot of primary source at Fisk University. And so I went to these Black universities as well as archives. I did a lot of research in Chicago, at the Chicago Historical Museum, at the Vivian Horsch collection, to find out Ebony magazine, as well as the Chicago Defender. And I didn't mention Ethel Payne. Remember that I said Black correspondents left the Black press after integration. Ethel Payne remained with the Chicago Defender. And in 1967, the Chicago headline, the Defender headline read, "Our man in Vietnam is a woman." And that woman was Ethel Payne. She told the story of the Black troops. She wrote about everything relative to Blacks in Vietnam. And she wrote about the Vietnamese people too. She wrote about the landscape. And that's the other thing about Black foreign correspondence. I don't want you all to think that it was just about social justice and so forth. Wherever these people traveled, they tried to write stories that educated their readers. So they talked about the climate, they talked about the landscape, they talked about the music, they talked about the culture. Because again, they wanted to change the perception, and they wanted that conversation for democracy to take place. So thank you for your time and your questions.
Let's give a really big round of applause for Dr. Broussard. What a fabulous conversation this was. Absolutely fabulous. Thank you. So I know you're all dying to know who wins the prizes today. So the winner of the public radio nerd coffee mug is Gary Peterson. There's Gary. And the winner of the book is Keisha Malvo. Where's Keisha? All right. Congratulations and thanks to everybody for coming. So next month we get a two for one. So you'll be hearing from Dr. Paul Miller and Dr. Tracy Birch about hurricanes and floods on Tuesday, August 30th, right at the heart of hurricane season. So I hope that you'll join us for that. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for joining us online, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Good night.